Abraham Lincoln carried his adopted state of Illinois in the election of 1860 and brought a Republican governor and legislature with him. But the triumph did not mark the beginning of heady times for the state's Republicans. The trials of war soon brought the state's Democrats back into favor. Throughout the conflict, the two parties' competition provided a framework for the discussion, sometimes peaceful, other times less so, of war aims. A significant number of Illinoisans turned to extra-political activities, including violence, in hopes of pushing their preferred policies into reality. But the Democratic Party came to represent those skeptical of the Union's war effort, while a significant portion of the state's new Republican Party coalesced around a patriotic call for a more vigorous prosecution of the conflict. For most of the war, President Lincoln remained in the middle. As the Confederate States announced their secession from the Union, Illinois' Democratic leader Stephen A. Douglas, long a thorn in Republican sides, abruptly changed his stance and pledged his full support to President Lincoln. Douglas frankly admitted his own tendency toward leaning too far to the southern section of the Union and urged his followers to support the president. Then, on June 3, 1861, Douglas passed away, the victim of a fever. In his absence, the Illinois Democratic Party struggled to pull together under the Union banner. While open-air secession meetings proved popular in southern Illinois, and a number of Democratic politicians openly supported the Confederacy at first, the party eventually accepted its role in the Union. Congressman John A. Logan, who had originally compared Confederate secessionists with the United States Founding Fathers, accepted a commission in the Volunteer Army and urged all patriots to sustain the government in its efforts to vindicate the Constitution. Many of Logan's supporters followed his lead, and Illinois' heavily Democratic southern sectors, which had once talked of seceding from the state, led the way in military enlistments. Nevertheless, many Illinois Democrats continued to oppose the war for the Union. While Illinois Democrats struggled with the challenge of disunion, many of the state's Republicans became increasingly impatient with the federal government and President Lincoln. The War Department entered the Civil War largely unprepared for combat and labored to organize a war effort. The Illinois State Journal complained, "Our people venerate law next to God, but they are restive under the restraining operations of red tape. The idea of waiting for orders from Washington to defend ourselves or protect our outraged Union brothers in Missouri may not much longer be brooked." Republicans soon took umbrage with President Lincoln's treatment of General John C. Fremont as well. The Republican Party's first presidential candidate in 1856, and a well-known explorer of the Mountain West, Fremont became the commander of the Department of War's Western Division, headquartered in St. Louis, with Lincoln's appointment in 1861. Fremont's forces struggled with inadequate support from the beleaguered War Department. But the general also proved to be an ideologue, often incapable of following the commander-in-chief's larger policies. In the late summer of 1861, Fremont issued a proclamation declaring martial law in Missouri and the emancipation of slaves there. Many Illinois Republicans, especially abolitionists, cheered Fremont's action. But Lincoln, moving cautiously in a war to preserve the Union, annulled Fremont's order and eventually removed him from command, bringing down his supporters' wrath. Democrats turned the Republicans' disarray into victory in the fall of 1861, taking over the state legislature. Many Illinoisans feared that the Democrats, led by senior leaders from southern Illinois, would attempt to dislodge that region from the state and unite it with the Confederacy. Others believed that the legislature would use its powers to block the state's contribution to the Union war effort. But the Democratic leadership proved uninterested in such sweeping goals, and instead turned to the familiar pursuit of partisan advantage. Democrats quickly took up an investigation of the state's war expenditures in search of unseemly contracts and graft, and found unusually high expenditures. Such discoveries failed to translate to political capital in wartime, however. A Democratic report of the treatment of Illinois troops in the field found no wrongdoing, once again yielding no campaign leverage. The Democrats soon turned to the framing of a new state constitution, a project that the voters had set in motion in the election of 1860. The legislators arranged a scheme of political apportionment that provided the state's less populous southern counties with representation equal to those in the rapidly growing north. Their approach to economic regulation returned to the familiar democratic themes of the antebellum period, framing provisions discouraging banking and the circulation of paper currency. One provision bluntly stated that all laws enacted after the adoption of this Constitution, which create corporations, amend existing charters, or grant special or exclusive privileges to individuals, shall be subject to alteration, amendment, or repeal. The body also proposed to incorporate into the document a prohibition of black immigration to Illinois, first taken up in 1853. Republicans of northern Illinois howled in protest at the proposed Constitution. The bank and currency provisions promised to damage economic development in northern regions increasingly marked by railroads and factories. In a maddening refrain of the national sectional crisis, the new Constitution's political apportionment threatened to subject the entire state to the political will of a southern minority. Shall the manufacturing, agricultural, and commercial interests of northern Illinois be put into Egyptian bondage? Wondered the Aurora Beacon. Republicans ultimately organized their campaign against the new Constitution, to be tested by a voters' referendum, around the theme of loyalty. Why is it that every rebel sympathizer in Illinois is open-mouthed for the adoption of this new Constitution? Asked the Illinois State Journal. Down with the secession Constitution, added the Chicago Tribune. Voters responded by rejecting each of the Constitution's provisions, except the bans on black settlement, voting, and office holding, which carried by large margins. While Abraham Lincoln pursued a war to preserve the Union in 1861 and 1862, radical Republicans in Illinois, including Governor Yates and Senator Lyman Trumbull labored to advance the cause of emancipation. One Illinoisan wrote that the federal government had a higher and holier mission to perform than to lavish hundreds of millions of treasure and to sacrifice tens of thousands of the lives of our noblest young men to see how strong it can hold a traitor's Negro with one hand and how successfully it can fight his master with the other. When President Lincoln persisted in maintaining a conservative policy aimed at retaining slave-holding border states like Kentucky and Missouri for the Union, Illinois Republicans' patience snapped. One editor blasted the imbecility of President Lincoln, whom he believed had done more to aid secession than Jefferson Davis. Governor Yates and Senator Trumbull each questioned the president's ability to lead the nation.